Thank you all for coming. I think I'm excited for this panel. I think it's going to be an interesting one. We may disagree, we may agree. Let's see what everybody has to say about it. So we're talking about second layers today. Let's first define terms. I think, John, you were keen to talk about this and set down terms. So what is a layer? What is scaling? Let's hear from you.
So yeah, I think that a lot of people have crosstalk when they have this conversation because they don't first define what a layer even is. And they all kind of operate under the assumption that pretty much anything is a layer. And when you do that, you kind of remove the meaning from it. And so for me, to make the definition of what is a layer useful, I would say it's any external system to Bitcoin that settles to Bitcoin in a trustless or deterministic way. So, for example, Lightning really fits this really well. It's one of the few things I would classify as a Bitcoin layer because it actually is made out of Bitcoin transactions. And when you're done, it goes into the Bitcoin blockchain, and there is a kind of enforceable way and flow for making that happen. Whereas that wouldn't necessarily be true for something like Liquid.
Right. So I think what you're trying to get at is this notion of a unilateral peg out or unilateral exit from that layer. I guess that's how you're viewing it, John. Do you guys have any other views, Justin or Scott?
So I guess what would be the word for ways of using Bitcoin, a Bitcoin denominated thing, right? That have trust, right? We need a word for that. I always think of layers as every other way to use Bitcoin that isn't on-chain Bitcoin. That's just what's in my head, and it's a semantic difference, I guess. But we need a word for ways of using Bitcoin, sending a Bitcoin transaction that involves some trust, right? Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what most people in the market are choosing. So what kind of word would you use for that?
So I think the distinction is important because if you don't make that distinction, maybe there's something a little more lenient, I don't know. But if you don't make the distinction as I described it, then you end up equating any of the things you're describing aren't any different than, say, a Coinbase account. Like if I have all my Bitcoin in Coinbase, like, am I using a layer? You know, and then you just kind of notice that you can do this with like anything. Like if I'm like sending you a private key in Telegram, am I using the Telegram layer of Bitcoin? Like it just gets weird. And so you have to draw some kind of line to have a definition. And the reason that's important is because if custodial Bitcoin isn't actually Bitcoin, it's an IOU, it's a relationship with somebody you trust. And so there's nothing wrong with trust, but if you use this with Bitcoin, then you're not actually taking advantage of the qualities of why Bitcoin was invented in the first place.
Scott, let's hear from you. Do you have any thoughts? What should count as a layer?
Well, I think it's very important that the definition of a layer should effectively be any layer that has representation of the asset on the other layer, such as a Coinbase account would be a layer. And because if we move into the definition where it's so tight so that it has to be a non-custodial locked up Bitcoin, it effectively means we're only locked into Liquid or Lightning as the only option for any form of scaling or any form of layer which is built on Bitcoin. And one of the big difficulties that we've faced with scaling Bitcoin is just exactly how do we go about it. And everyone here in attendance agrees with you 100% that the ideal scenario would be the absolutely trustlessness between the primary issuance layer and the secondary layer. And if we have that super tight definition, which you're proposing, which we all agree to and we all want, it's only Lightning today that is possible to actually scale Bitcoin, and it's payments only. And I think the technical challenge of overcoming how we have a trustless peg or wrap or whatever, how you want to call it, is a technical solution, much like the invention of Bitcoin, how you have a decentralized and trustless currency to begin with. So having that super narrow definition basically excludes the conversation of like how do you have asset issuance layers, etc., or can all of that be put into Lightning as well? How would that work? And I mean, Lightning is, shall we say, still in development very much.
I'd maybe edit a few things there because like not only do you have to define what layer is, but you have to define what scaling means. And scaling actually means adding capacity or cost or overhead to a network to increase throughput or users and this kind of thing. And if you include things that are not actually atomically or deterministically attached to Bitcoin, then again, you get into saying that everything is scaling. And then it becomes, what do you mean? Scaling what? Are you scaling Bitcoin? Are you scaling exposure to the Bitcoin price? You're not talking about networking concepts anymore. And the other thing is, two more things. One, Lightning isn't the only layer by any means. We had Omni, which is a way of encoding data into the op return. That's probably one of the first Bitcoin layers. That's a way of doing layers and being able to do assets, for example. And then you have things like open timestamps, you have ARC, which is something people are talking about now, and there will be more. And so, yes, the only thing that you could technically do with a layer is scale an aspect of Bitcoin, whether it be probably not users, but transaction throughput, transaction size. You can think of all the qualities of a transaction and find a way to scale them using a layer. And I think I was going to say another point, but I forgot it. So.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess what I'm taking from this is maybe the disagreement here is about being able to unilaterally exit, but at the same time, we also understand that Bitcoin on-chain today will obviously not scale to 8 billion people self-custodially today. I think everybody understands that, even with Lightning today. So then the question is, how do we, because you might believe in Bitcoin as the future of money and be a monetary maximalist, but not necessarily like a chain maximalist. Like not everything has to be on the chain per se. So I guess let's proceed and talk a little bit about what everybody's working on, and just give a bit of an overview for everybody, because I think probably we'll start with you, Justin, in terms of what is a mint, what's a Fedimint, and can you just explain a bit of an overview for everybody?
Yeah, so just following along what you just said right there, my sort of background was expecting that Bitcoin would become very popular, everyone in the world would start to use it, and starting to realize that we won't get close to everybody owning a UTXO, and it will take years for everybody to open a channel if we wanted everyone on Lightning, right? And if fees are high and you can't afford a closing transaction, then a channel isn't very secure. And at the same time, it's pretty difficult for the average user to run a Lightning node. I always struggled. I lost money multiple times trying to run Lightning nodes in the early days. I know it's gotten a lot better. So I was interested in ways to make Lightning succeed, like help it succeed. And so that's why I got into Fedimint. Fedimint is, I think of it as like a programmable multisig. That's what a federation is, right? So it's funds held in a multisig that you can apply rules to, right? And so one set of rules is some contracts in Fedimint that allow a Lightning node to pay transactions, make payments on behalf of the users of the mint, right? Send payments on their behalf, receive payments on their behalf. And then also an accounting system called eCash that's very private. So this helps address some of the privacy shortfalls in Lightning. And the really appealing thing is that one Lightning node could serve like 10 or 100,000 users. And to me, that's what Lightning really excels at, is a professional node operator with lots of channels who's good at managing liquidity, can provide services on behalf of a lot of users. And so this is kind of an appealing step kind of towards the world, a non-custodial kind of freedom-oriented world from where we're at today, where everybody's on centralized custodians, right? So the idea of having Fedimints there could be many Fedimints, they could be smaller, more local in communities, and these people could provide Bitcoin services for their local residents.
Yeah. And as we speak today, I think I looked up the stat a little while ago. In terms of fiat banks, there's about 44,000 banks in the world today. But in a Bitcoin world, we could have millions of banks. Some of those could be community banks. Some of those could be self-custodial. Of course, with Bitcoin, be your own bank is a long-standing message, and we encourage people to do that where they can. Let's talk a little bit, just to get an overview as well from you, Scott. Can you give us a little bit of an overview around sidechains and how you're seeing them as part of this broader discussion?
Well, I think sidechains are. I had a speech just half an hour ago about sidechains, but sidechains are effectively chains which are attached to a main chain which has asset representations on that chain of the main chain, and potentially other assets can be issued on that chain as well. So you can have a payments layer integrated into an asset issuance layer, for instance, which is liquid, but it's possible to have a wide variety of different sidechains. Like Fedimint could be seen as a sidechain, depending on your definition of what a layer is. If you do view it as something where you have representations of the main chain on the side chain. If that's the definition, like anything can be a sidechain where you have the actual representation. But the question is, do you control the keys yourself or not? But I think the sidechains should at least have the definition that the user controls the keys themselves. But then there's a big question with regards to how the actual peg between the main chain and the sidechain works.
Okay, so the sidechain vision as well is like this idea of having, you peg out and you can peg back in. And in the case of Liquid, it's a federation. There's I think it's an 11 of 15 that, when you're trying to peg out, you're basically asking one of those people to help you peg back out if you want to receive Bitcoin, back on chain. That's the current, I guess a well-known sidechain model today. There are other potential sidechain ideas out there. And so let's go back to you, John. Do you want to just offer a bit of your own comment on how you see some of those differences then between Lightning, mints, and sidechains?
Sure. I'll also comment from my own vertical of this topic, I guess, for lack of a better word. We tackle the layering concept in two ways. One, we fully embrace Lightning because we think Bitcoin is important for something for commerce, and that we need to be able to have people be spending, paying with it, doing business with it regularly. And Lightning currently is at least the best solution for doing this with Bitcoin, to have high-frequency instant payments to eventually have a great user experience. But we also approach this from another way where we feel there hasn't been enough research that just assumes that maybe you don't need a blockchain for any of those things that you use layers for. And so we basically have a protocol called /tags where we explore doing things like assets. Well, that's more related to hole punch and such. But in other words, we explore stacks of technology through a protocol to see what we can do without a blockchain at all, and whether we can do it better if we don't use a blockchain. So it could be assets, identity, all these different things you hear from altcoin, shitcoin, use cases. We explore whether they could or should be done without a blockchain. So that's another angle. As far as where I would position, say, Fedimint and Liquid, so forgive me, I am a critical person. That will be kind of the tone of how I describe it. But I see the Fedimint, I see it as there's nothing wrong with good research on making custodial software solutions that are better than what we have today. And I could definitely see how, if exchanges or different services were running this, you could have improved qualities for the users and maybe even for the service providers. Now, I know their angle is more towards community providers and not running it as a business, but the technology is still applicable in either way for something like that. I don't like the idea of portraying it as scaling Bitcoin, because I just think we have to have a lot more pressure on figuring out actually scaling Bitcoin so people can hold their own Bitcoin keys. And I just feel like it's okay for other people to explore other avenues, but I need to stick to that because that's what's most important, because you lose the qualities of Bitcoin when you don't do that. With Liquid, I would say, the sidechain thing proved to not actually be atomically possible, like trustless pegging.
Right, the two-way trustless peg is what you're
and so
to.
What you kind of end up with is you end up with a Bitcoin-themed altcoin, because I think of it sort of like this blockchain. I have to go to this federation, this group of people that decide what the exchange rate is for their token against Bitcoin, and they currently peg it to Bitcoin. But it's still like I'm buying the Liquid coin, and they are just trying to maintain a peg when I come in and out. But it's a permissioned system, right? So it's not custodial in the sense that maybe a mint might be, but it's still permissioned, and you can be locked out, locked in, censored, things like this. But what's interesting about Liquid is it allows you to kind of have a test layer to do Bitcoin things. Like Liquid can implement proposed sidechain, proposed soft forks, proposed features. They can take more risks because they have more central power to fix a mistake or adjust or backtrack. And it's a good playground in that sense. And I'd certainly rather see people use Liquid as a playground than, say, Litecoin or Ethereum or things like this.
Right, and I think the point there is that I don't view Liquid BTC as an altcoin per se. It's more like an IOU. That's how I'm viewing it, because it's pegged, right? Every LBTC, you can see, there's Bitcoin that was pegged in, right? It's possible.
You have no way to enforce the peg. They could change the rate if they wanted.
So one way I look at kind of improving Bitcoin, right? I'm going to use a word that's not just general, right? So we don't argue over semantics, right? Just how do we improve Bitcoin, make it easier for more people to use in the real world, right? There's kind of two ways to go about it. And I started with the first one I'm going to describe, and then I switched to the second one. The first one is you just try to build the best trustless, non-custodial, kind of try to bring people to our vision, like the way we use Bitcoin, right? Like this is how I use Bitcoin. This is probably how all of us use Bitcoin. But very, very few people in the world use it this way. Like you can go to the App Store and you see the number of reviews for apps, right? And the apps we talk about and use have like 40 reviews. And then you go look at some of the ones that are popular and there's 10 million, right? And so like another way of doing it is to try to meet people where they are, right? Everybody is on centralized custodians and just try to build something that is a few steps closer to the way we use Bitcoin, right? Like more private, less trusted, not trustless, but less trusted. And so to me, that's what Fedimint is. It's like it's trying to go to where the people are and bring them this way. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. We need people doing both, right? Like we're not going to succeed by doing one or the other. We need a lot of people doing both.
Yeah, I would hope people take my answers more as analytical or critical in an analytical sense than I'm saying that any of these things are evil or bad. It's just I choose my priorities for how I spend my time or resources, and you choose yours. I could be wrong about my priorities. It's totally possible, but I have to choose something.
Well, and the thing is like, there's so many people, if we're right, and Bitcoin is really the way people are going to store their, the value of their labor, right? We need so many more services, solutions, products than we have now, right? Like if you had a billion people try to onboard today, I just don't think we're close to ready.
I think that scale will come as necessary, and that's why I like. That's why I choose the path that I choose. Is that I think that the true way, necessity is the mother of all invention.
Yeah.
And so when there's we hit a wall with Bitcoin, then a solution will emerge. And I like that process is more incentive aligned to me than a lot of speculative methods.
Speaking of hitting walls, we had a recent high fee spike, and it might be interesting to talk a little bit about all the different whatever layers or whatever we're calling non-layers in this case. How did they deal in a high fee environment? So do you guys want to, well, we haven't heard from you, Scott, so do you want to tell us a little bit about how things work in a high fee environment, or at least recently?
Well, for Liquid's purposes, the fee environment is very low. So there's essentially no fee pressure. I don't think I've seen a full block for a long time. But in terms of the fee pressure, when it came to Bitcoin, we saw quite a bit of uptick in volumes, both with regards to some people coming across and trying Liquid due to the low fees, but also due to some of the Lightning channels being a low payment fee network or small payments, and all of a sudden it's super expensive to rebalance channels. So I think bolts moved across to Lightning, so they anchored everything. They moved their Lightning implementation across to Liquid. So they anchored it to the Liquid chain as opposed to the Bitcoin chain due to the fee pressure, and to be able to experiment and develop on Liquid instead. Because if you're an end user and you're just managing your key and just doing payments, like are you really bothered if it's tied to Liquid or if it's tied to Bitcoin? I mean, everyone in here will have a strong opinion, but if the average user out there are shall we say, where they don't want to pay the high fee pressure to rebalance because it's a small channel, it may make a lot of sense to have these channels on a sidechain like Liquid. But then there's questions about interoperability and everything else around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that maybe there's two ways to look at this. You have that generally fees are an exclusive property. So at some point, there's a threshold of people that get kicked off the system that can't use the system at a certain fee rate. And that keeps growing the higher the fees goes. More and more people become excluded from use cases. And so this is what's tricky that we have to deal with Bitcoin is at some point you hit walls and you have to decide whether to change the size of things. Like when we added the SegWit block to make blocks bigger during 2017. Now we're finally hitting that size, and fees are higher than normal and kind of staying there. That means that there are some people that don't use Bitcoin anymore. And then, so when that happens, that when they get excluded, they seek an alternative, and the other side of this is we saw that things attached to Bitcoin, like Lightning, start buckling under the pressure. When Bitcoin hits saturation of usage, blocks are full, mempools are full, you start getting dropped from mempools, etc. You start noticing, hey, well, the trade-offs to make Lightning work are also less certain and more expensive. And you get these weird dynamics that happen. Like if I had a $50 Lightning channel and it costs $55 for a fee, that channel just became trusted until things change, because I can't enforce the channel to actually own my own money. So there's all these things that change, and so we have to figure out how to make Bitcoin dynamic enough to deal with these situations, or scaled enough to deal with these situations, where people will use alternatives. And maybe using a Bitcoin-themed custodian or a Bitcoin-themed sidechain is some way measurable than them using an altcoin. But to the user, they're not going to be as ideological as maybe we are. They're going to say, oh, well, I'm on an exchange and I need to send money, and if I send it on Litecoin, it costs me 10 cents and it'll get there in 2 minutes. And if I send it on Bitcoin, it's going to cost me $50 and take 10 to 20 minutes. They're going to make a decision, and that's what Bitcoin's competing against. It's that exclusionary behavior when fees go up.
So I think,
but that's true of self-custody or custodial, right? It's true for across the board.
Well, custodial are more incentivized to remove fees entirely, as you can see with banks, because they end up being able to leverage your assets.
Right, because and this comes to that question of, what do you think is worse, custodial Bitcoin or altcoins, right? Would you rather people use a custodial Bitcoin solution until they are, let's say, rich enough that they can afford to go non-custodial? There's
a third option, scaling Bitcoin.
Right, okay, so I mean, as an example, there might be some soft fork ideas, things like any prep out or something like this that might increase the capacity there. Maybe there are future ideas yet to come.
So I think an interesting thing about community banking, which is like something that's been around the world for a long time. My grandpa was a community banker, small town with 800 people. That's one of the reasons I kind of got interested in the Fedimint vision. Is I think it could lead to more self-custody over time, right? If you have a dense group of people who are able to start using Bitcoin, start saving in a Fedimint, it's custodial, but you have people you can go to for help, right? And you have a social layer that can emerge. Over time, I think this would lead to more self-custody, right? Because people would develop savings, they'd develop some comfort, they'd develop belief that the thing would be worth something a year or 10 from now. And over time, once they had the wealth to merit it, they'd go buy a hardware wallet. They'd go to someone to get help setting it up. So that's my hope. Maybe I'm a little too optimistic, but I think if the community banking vision is realized through Fedimint or Galoy or others, I think over time will lead to more self-custody, because very few people deposit their first Bitcoin into a hardware wallet, right? Most people start somewhere else, and eventually, as they build more confidence and have more knowledge, then they convert to self-custody.
Yeah. Anything to add, guys? No? Okay, so, well, I think maybe one challenge people might be thinking is, okay, but if all these people get onboarded into a custodial solution, what if that custodial solution doesn't encourage them to later self-custody? Because maybe there's a dark pattern or some kind of incentive for them to keep you in the custodial environment, because maybe they are, like in the fiat world today, where they are using your assets in some way, or they are doing, the incentive is sort of for them to not teach you to self-custody or not encourage you to self-custody.
Or a similar aspect is, I feel like one of the biggest tragedies in crypto is when you have somebody that's Bitcoin interested lose all their money because they made the wrong choice. And that, to me, as far as I know, is more likely to happen when they use a custodian or a service somehow than when they self-custody. People are scared to lose the Bitcoin they hold themselves, but the amount of Bitcoin lost that way, at least in the past 5-10 years, is probably a lot smaller than the amount of Bitcoin or even altcoins lost in exchanges, rug pulls, all these kinds of things. And so you're right, like somebody like FTX is highly incentivized to keep you there. They're not trying to train you. Coinbase is incentivized to create the Earn program where you get paid to learn all about more altcoins. They're not trying to get you to withdraw. They're trying to get you to make activity in their platform. So yeah, it's definitely a factor. And I don't want to see everybody, we had like $8 billion of loss from like 4 entities in the last bull bear market. It's a tragedy because those people are going to not see Bitcoin as any different.
Yeah. So I guess maybe this is the way forward. Let's talk a little bit about interoperability, right? Whether, even if we're saying Lightning is the true layer 2 and, Fedimint and Liquid and Sidechains aren't unilateral exit capable, let's say, what does interoperability mean, and does that help the overall broader Bitcoin mission?
Yeah, so the way I look at Lightning is it's kind of like the lingua franca of all these little hubs that are going to pop up around Bitcoin. And so, to me, I think that's where Lightning is amazing, right? When you have like a professional node operator with lots of liquidity who can amortize the cost of capital, which is very high in Lightning, especially for a single user, over lots of activity. So that's kind of what I think is like Lightning is the lingua franca that every one of these parts can speak over, right? So when you're paying into a Fedimint, you wouldn't even know it.
Right.
It just looks like it's a Lightning invoice.
You scan it, you pay it.
Lightning invoice, right? When you send it out, when you get paid from one, you don't know. It just looks like HTLC showed up, right? So that's the way I see is the superpower of Lightning is that it can connect all these parts of the ecosystem.
Yeah. Scott, do you want to add anything there in terms of interoperability?
In terms of interoperability, I mean the Lightning implementations work rather well, but if you look at like Bitcoin as the main chain, and if we allow the definition where sidechains are something also other than Lightning, if you look at interoperability, you're also speaking about how do you jump from a sidechain to a sidechain, because then it might work with like net deferred settlement models, so that you can move between all these sidechains and just settle periodically up on the Bitcoin main chain. And in terms of that type of interoperability, a lot of questions there which haven't been really explored. Everything from cross-chain swaps to, I mean, if you really want to scale Bitcoin, like how do you issue assets? How do you create capital markets? How do you do registry management? How do you do like all of these registry tasks, but where you have the premise that the user controls the keys to these assets as opposed to some ledger operator? Because that's effectively where we want to go. And with so Lightning is a fantastic solution, but it's focused on, should we say, Bitcoin payments and not registry updates in general. So how do we build a whole ecosystem around this where you have interoperability between all these sidechains, where you can jump between them, but where we maintain Bitcoin as the, should we say, settlement of payments layer, which I think everyone is after, and something we hopefully all can agree about, the control keys and the be able to issue everything like with the user being able to control the asset themselves without having to go through a central ledger provider that controls everything on people's behalf.
So just for the audio guys, I'm not able to hear Scott very clearly, but if you're able to make sure he's coming out of the monitor, because I can't hear him very clearly. But yeah, sorry, go on.
No, I think that was the point, that interoperability also moves, how do you connect all these sidechains to each other and settle between them and connect them to the main chain, and how do you add all these asset issuance layers so that you can build also all the registry management. So we're not just speaking about payments only. If we are to see Bitcoin as a global settlement of payments layer, it should be able to have capital market infrastructure built around it as well.
Okay, so I couldn't quite hear it. I think something's wrong with the monitor, so sorry, guys. Let's talk a little bit about the asset issuance aspect, right? That was part of what you were talking about. I think, as I understood, you were talking about how Bitcoin payments is one thing, but interoperating with assets and trading around for assets is another aspect that maybe some of the sidechains might be assisting people with that. So let's talk a little bit about layers competing or complementing each other. So I think we've sort of touched on this idea. Does anyone on the panel have any thoughts on the complementary nature of different solutions here?
I think I can kind of wrap it into the previous question too, because interoperability is a concept or a dynamic you have to manage. Like for users, they think interoperability is just everything just works for them. Everything works together. Doesn't matter where they go. Like everything just works. That's how they see it. But for people building platforms, protocols, etc., it means like highly increased complexity and much more inefficiency. You need a lot of conversion, a lot of being ways to resolving different addresses from multiple formats, converting one asset to another asset, and so you introduce friction when you introduce interoperability. And to mention how these things interplay, like as layers, well, there's the incentive to interoperate is basically that you want the users from that network over there to be in your network, or you want your network to be able to move to that network. So it's always like a migration incentive, and typically that's a competitive incentive. Somebody says, oh, I want to add support for this so I can get users from that platform or that network. There's some incentive to compete. So there's kind of, while on the user side, it's very like seen as cooperative and they just want everything to be seamless. From the provider side, it's fairly competitive because you're introducing complexity and conversion to make it possible, which means I have cost and work and risk. And so I have to have incentive to basically get something from that network.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think it can apply in different ways. So I think even just in an example of Bitcoin on-chain payment or Lightning, that can have different choices that the user then gets presented with and has to now make a decision. Do I pay this on-chain or do I pay it with Lightning?
Those two definitely compete because when fees go up, you see Lightning, the Lightning graphs go up too.
Right. And so then, even from a systems point of view, or even the Lightning node as an example, in the Fedimint example, if everyone's using all the Lightning nodes capacity, then the Lightning operator now has to quickly make sure he's got enough capacity on the channels because everyone's using Lightning now. And I guess that's also true for you, John.
A concept that we have with slash tags is another way to approach interoperability is abstraction. And so where, for example, we have a payment protocol where you just use a pub key to be able to pay a contact or a peer. But what it actually does is it takes you to a DHT network and you can find all the payment endpoints. And so rather than supporting every network, what it does is it checks which things your peer supports, it compares it to which things you support, and it sees if there's a match. And so, for example, if I want to pay you using Lightning, when I try to pay you over the slash tags payment protocol, and if you don't have a Lightning way method for me to pay you, then I say, well, I also have Bitcoin, and then maybe you can give me an on-chain address. And it automates this process, so it allows things to compete at a peer level instead of having to add any interoperability.
Yeah, I see. So how many people can use each of these systems, platforms? Is there upper bounds on these kinds of things? What are some of the upper limits, at least that exist today for some of these, whether it's Lightning, whether it's Liquid or Sidechains, or whether it's Fedimint?
Lightning's limits are basically falling from Bitcoin. So Lightning can scale like the frequency of transactions, but it can't scale users. And so if you need some way to have more user capacity, more people buying a channel or creating a channel at the same time or in a close time frame, you would need to add scale to Bitcoin. That would be your limiting factor. I don't think there is a limit for custodial Bitcoin or extra blockchains. We've seen people just keep making more and more of them. But as far as scaling and limits, they're mostly derived from Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I think the Lightning Network will look differently if you 100x the number of nodes. we've kind of seen this over time. It becomes more hub and spoke, right? And I think it'll continue to be that way. So with some of these, as they scale, they look differently, and maybe the properties degrade a little bit from a, trustlessness, self-sovereignty point of view. The idea with Fedimint is to try to make it so you can deploy lots of them, right? So instead of having one thing that over time moves slowly because everyone has to agree on it, let's make it modular so different deployments can choose the features they want, and some can specialize and some can specialize in different ways. So with Fedimint, it's like, I think a Fedimint could probably support, once it's more production ready, maybe 100,000, 1 million users in one, and then it would start to hit a limit, but then you can always deploy more of them.
Yeah, with Liquid, there's also a block size, just like for Bitcoin. So it's limited to the block size and the transactions. But also it should be mentioned that since transactions are confidential, there's a lot more that goes into them so that they take a lot more space. But then there's a block every minute, so there's potentially 10 times more space, but that would be chewed up by the extra encryption that's added to have confidential transactions. So the capacity is about the same as Bitcoin in terms of transaction capacity, but in terms of issuance capacity, there should be no limit.
Yeah. And in terms of second layers, we're generally giving something up in order. There's no free lunch. So with Lightning, generally that means there's an online requirement. Usually, in some cases, there's different trade-offs being made around that. So I guess we can also speak to some of the different trade-offs being made by the different approaches here. So, for example, as a Fedimint user, maybe it's kind of more like a custodial experience. You don't really need to think about channels. You don't really need to think about, is my phone online? Whereas, let's say for John, when he's building with Synonym, maybe he, for users to be able to take a payment while they're offline, and it's a mobile phone app, there's certain trade-offs around that, right? Whereas, let's say in a Liquid case, it's kind of more just like on-chain. You just pay through the address. But there's a custodial trade-off, right? So would you say that's a reasonably fair summary then, or do you have anything you guys want to add in terms of what are the trade-offs, what are the costs that we pay in order to use these different systems?
I think it's really important to acknowledge that when you're talking about networks and all these topics, everything really is trade-offs. Like you're just rearranging things because in this use case you have different priorities. And so Lightning is not magic. It's trading some of the great things about on-chain Bitcoin for some better things about Lightning, but there's a trade. And with Lightning, like for example, one of the trade-offs is you have to do active enforcement. You have to do it yourself. Transacting, for now at least, requires interactivity. Both people have to be online at the same time. And these are negative trade-offs, but you get high-frequency payments, instant settlement, things like this.
Yeah, with Lightning, you trust software a lot more. Kind of, it's very complicated, and every once in a while you see a catastrophic bug show up, and so far they haven't really had loss of funds, but you are trusting a lot of software there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Let's take 1 minute each for each of you. Make your pitch for what you're working on, and I guess some of your if you've got any closing thoughts. Let's start with you, Scott.
Okay. So we're working on the Liquid network, and since Liquid has multi-asset issuance, we've built a non-custodial wallet where everyone can hold their own balances, and we've built this swap order book where people can post swap limit orders for any asset they hold in their wallet. So they add their own inputs and outputs, just post this in the bulletin board, basically, which anyone else can pick up, and they can create an atomic swap from this, so that the two assets which are on-chain are traded directly between the two counterparties in a peer-to-peer settlement. But with confidential transactions, there's no AML, there's no KYC. All of that happens at the asset issuance layer. If you have a permissioned asset, the receiver has to be permission to receive as well, but these swaps are peer-to-peer. There's no KYC, no AML. It's exactly as Bitcoin was intended to be built, but with the addition of the asset issuance, so that we can finally have exchanges which are non-custodial. If you then, but the trade-off is you need to trust the Liquid network, the peg. But once you peg in, there's liquidity in the markets, and you can just go in and out, as well as have the securities issuance and manage all the registries around it. Done. Thanks.
John?
Sure. At Synonym, we're building a number of products to have an whole ecosystem that is focused on just assuming Bitcoin will win and saying, okay, Bitcoin is the only blockchain we need. The only thing we actually need Bitcoin for is for payments and store of value. And anything else that's related or complementary to that should and could be done without a blockchain. And we try to express that through slash tags. And so we try to show this user experience first in our wallet, which is a mobile wallet called BitKit. And then we try to build out the slash tags use cases and keep demonstrating them within that. But we're also going to be building other products like publishing platforms and ways that you can show that you can use these systems in a very decentralized way, in a self-sovereign way. We want people to be able to be portable and go anywhere they want and still be who they are and have keys that they control for everything, for their data, for their money, for everything, and kind of reinvent the web using this structure.
Gotcha. Justin, you get the last word.
All right, thank you, Stephan. So Fedimint is a way to set up a community bank that is Lightning native, very private, and you choose a few trusted people from your community to guard the Bitcoin of everyone else. And it's also very extensible. Over time, I think more and more experiences and services will be able to deliver through Fedimint. We've spent a lot of time building this platform over the last year. And if you'd like to experience it, we have our first little trial test federation on mainnet running. If you go to the front entrance, there's a QR code you can scan to get started, or head up the Fedi booth in the exhibition hall, and we'll show you around.
All right, well, I think that's all we have time for. So thank you, everyone. Please put your hands together for our panelists, Justin, Scott, and John.